Good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Easton, the Chair and Co-Founder of EG Funds Management, and I'm very proud to be here today with Dr. Shane Gahar, the G in EG, and we formed the company 25 years ago. I've been asked to introduce the panel, which I'll do in a moment, but I've also been asked, why are you interested to be a sponsor today? And I do so in order for an info commercial and to evangelise. If you go through the booklet before us, you'll see a few pages towards the back an advertisement about the Little Big House. It's a charity that EG is proud to be involved in supporting, and we believe that one of the things that developers and all of us involved in this community can focus on with respect to equity and the resilience of our community that we've talked about today, is to ensure that we do our bit to create and curate better communities. And in doing so, fight the injustices associated with mental health and loneliness. And that's why we've created a Little Big House where we have a community centre in all of the developments that we're embarking on. For example, at Summer Hill, we have 60 events a month, and most of the people who turn up are not from the community that is involved in the old flour mill there. It's the wider community. And we have people who come along and say, for example, a quote I heard last year, I've rented at 9 different locations. This is the first place I feel is home. I've also heard people say, as a result of the different aspects of involving people in the development and in the wider community, people getting to know each other, creating a market that is held every month, the best in the Inner West, that we're bringing people together and we're trying to ensure that people are not alone in their dwelling, but they're interacting. So the Little Big Foundation, there's a link to it, it's the reason I'm here. I commend the Committee for Sydney for its great work, especially in promoting this conference. We wanted to make sure, as EG, we focus on another aspect of intergenerational equity and ensuring that the communities that we're all involved in building are as resilient and as happy as they can be. Today we've got an interesting panel. It's my pleasure to introduce the panel members. We have Estelle Grech, who's the Planning Policy Manager of the Committee for Sydney, who a few years ago won the EG Prize, the Ethan Gahar Prize, for her studies at the end of her Bachelor of Town Planning degree at the University of New South Wales. We've also got panellists Kiersten Fishburn, the Secretary of the Department of Planning, Housing and Infrastructure, Kate Russell, Chief Executive Officer, Supply Nation, and we have Anhaar Kareem, Student and Youth Advocate, 16 years of age, to give a perspective of young people. Can you please join me in welcoming your panel members to the stage? Over to you, Giselle.
Thanks, Michael. And thanks all of you for joining me. I'm going to start with Kiersten. How are your shoulders? Because there must be quite a weight on them.
I always like to come back to the Minister for Planning often says it's great running planning because nobody has an opinion about it. So it's not just the challenge, it's managing, the community's expectations as well.
We're going to start with an easy question, not. Housing. We have to build a record number of homes in a short period of time, more than we've ever done before. How are you going to do this? Plus, think about intergenerational equity while we're doing it.
That's probably one of the more wicked questions, isn't it? Look, I think a lot about the way the planning system works in New South Wales and how we enable housing. one of the things that I suspect most people aren't aware of is that about 85 to sometimes 90% of all housing approvals are actually done at the local government level rather than the state level. I'd love to claim I'm responsible for the lot, but actually it's occurring in your local councils. And when I think about how do we make sure that intergenerational voice is heard, I really think about what is the composition of councils? Who is your democratic voice? I pulled up some data coming into this session, and 41% of councillors in New South Wales are aged over 60. We just go over 60. I can't tell you how many over 80, but I suspect there's a few of them. When we look at 18 to 29, so literally the people who are really priced out of the housing or the rental market, only 4.2% of councillors are in that age bracket. So you have a really disproportionate number of decisions being made at a local level that don't have the representative voice of young people there. We did see in local government during COVID, we made a lot of changes to allow councils to meet, so they can now meet online. There's a whole lot of other things that were brought into play. And we saw the proportion of women councillors as a consequence leap up. It's still not parity, but it's not bad. And it's improving election to election. So I think there's a piece of work we need to do about how do we get better engagement at that local council level? How do we make sure that it is attractive to become a councillor and voice is heard? One of the things that I have seen is that civic education piece of getting young people engaged in local democracy right from the start. One of the things I did that when I was at Liverpool Council that we were singularly proud of is we established a children's parliament, and these were year 5s and 6 kids from the local public schools. They'd come into the council chambers once a quarter, and I have to say they were the most civilised council meetings I ever attended when we had the year 5s and 6-ins. And they were able to present to myself and the mayor, my senior executive and other councillors on things that were important to them in the community. And I always come back to one of the very first meetings where they got up and they'd go and workshop it with their students. You know, they really took their democratic role responsibly. And they presented on the issue of local parks, and they said, look, once you're over about 8, parks are really boring. Like, we want to hang out in parks, but they're like, for toddlers, they're really boring. And I looked to my mayor and said, you know what, they actually are. They're really dull for kids over 8, and yet we want kids to be active, and these kids want to hang out in the parks. So we immediately went and rethought our designs for our next local park, Kashula Parklands, if you're ever out there, which has one of the longest and scariest slippery dips as far as I'm concerned, but I'm not the target audience of a 10-year-old who wants something a bit exciting happening. So getting more young people in local government, but to do that you need to educate them about the benefits of being involved, and you need to get some runs on the board that shows that their voices actually will be listened to and that you will make change as a consequence of what they are telling us.
Anna, thanks so much for taking the morning off school to be with us here today. I wanted to ask, have you or your friends ever put in a submission for a development application or a planning policy?
No, I mean, I'm 16 and friends in year 12 haven't put in an application for a DA. Yeah. To be completely honest, I had to search up what a development application was before today. Yeah. So I think, that's quite indicative of not really understanding what the system is like from a young age.
And that's exactly why I asked. So I guess we've got a planning system, there's lots of change coming, but if young people, count communities, First Nations people can't engage in it, like what does that mean in terms of the outputs that we get? So I guess, Kate and Anhaar, why do you think it's important for different voices to engage in the planning system, and how can we do it better? And maybe we'll start with Kate and come back.
Sure. Look, as a former employee of the Department of Planning, I have some professional and personal experience on this. What I've seen is that town planners, urban planners, transport planners, they really do want to engage better with the Indigenous community, but their hands are tied to some extent. They are also very process-driven people who aren't quite sure how to deviate from, this is the way we do things. But I think it's important that they remember that you have to have meaningful engagement with communities, any communities, if you actually want them to tell you what they think, what they want. You can't just put something in their letterbox saying you've got 2 weeks to go through this horribly irritating process that is online to tell us what you think, using a lot of technical jargon that no one, even I as a former, employee, struggle to understand.
Mate, I can't understand.
There you go. So we have to be doing things differently, but doing things differently means we have to change the system. We have to change the way that we engage. And public servants are time poor, like everybody else. They also need permission and authority to be able to go and make the time to sit down with mob and get to know them. You also just can't rock up and say, hey, we've never had a conversation, but please tell us what you think. Tell us why this site is important to you. Can you share us your intellectual property and, tell us what kind of story we should tell when we're redoing the park or we're redoing the local high street. We need to be doing things more meaningfully, based on relationships, based on trust, and based on open two-way communication.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think that having consultation for young people, for CALD communities and First Nations people is so important, and I think that's definitely lacking. I think that definitely has to be done in a way that isn't kind of jargony. I think ways that can be done sometimes have been demonstrated to be quite good. So for instance, my local council, Strathfield Council, has a youth board. I think that's really important in young people being able to do things like planning events and infrastructure. And I think that's just an example of having really meaningful engagement that isn't, sending out a letter. I think also there are probably more possibly radical, but I think really impactful ways to be able to achieve that. So I think one of them is something that I've been involved in is lowering the voting age, which is just the idea that 16 and 17-year-olds are affected by government decisions. If anything, they're affected more than a lot of other Australians because they're the ones that will disproportionately face the impacts of issues like climate change. They're the ones that are seeing really horrible impacts of cost of living crisis, have to pay HECS debt, but they also do things like work, pay taxes, they can enroll in the military. So I think that it's really important that they have a say in the democracy. Definitely civics education and other measures to involve them, I think, is really effective. But I think actually giving that very direct democratic avenue is super important.
Yeah, I wonder how our councillor demographics would change if 16-year-olds could vote as well.
Definitely.
Yeah, I think you'd certainly see a difference there, and I think you'd get some pretty terrific outcomes too.
Kate, I wanted to touch on how are the current housing, climate, social connectedness, all of these challenges that we're facing in Sydney affecting the businesses that you work with as well.
So we represent over 4,600 Indigenous businesses nationally. I did a quick search, like Kiersten, I did a bit of data before I came on stage. We have about 120 of those businesses based in what we would call the Sydney CBD, but we have over 240 based in Western Sydney. Western Sydney is the biggest Indigenous population in the country. So it makes sense that that is a huge and densely populated area for Indigenous businesses. Our family structures are slightly different. We have intergenerational households. We also have a sort of a polarised population in the fact that we have a lot of young people and we have a lot of older people. So not only do we have the intergenerational households, which means we need more space. Like, I know everybody wants a backyard, everybody wants a little bit of, well, most people do, but when you've got multiple generations of families who need different services, you need to be accessing healthcare for elder people, and you need to be accessing daycare for younger people. And for women like me that are now in the sandwich generation, we're caring up, we're caring down. I'm taking my small children to daycare, I'm taking my elderly parents to doctor's appointments. That puts a lot of pressure. For an Indigenous business, it's the same, but when they're located in Western Sydney, being able to have access to those services without having to travel great distances. I mean, I live in Ashfield, which is hardly the western suburbs, and it took me an hour to get here on public transport. If I'm trying to run a business and also having to come to the CBD because that's where I can access affordable office space, or if I have to come in because I need to go to a meeting, how am I going to be able to deliver my business? So I think it's the same challenges for any business owner, but when we are historically marginalised, when we do have that added disadvantage, I don't think that Indigenous businesses are necessarily that different from any other small to medium enterprise. We just often have a nice little sprinkling of, marginalisation and discrimination and racism, but the challenges are the same. When it comes to, we need to access services, we need to access space. There is still stigma about being a Western Sydney business, particularly in Sydney, where there is pressure to come in to the CBD a lot more, and that puts even more pressure on us as individuals to be managing our personal and professional.
Thanks everyone who submitted questions so far. I'm going to start weaving them in because there's one question from John that sort of like also touched on what you were saying in terms of multi-generational families and bigger families. And maybe I'll start with you, Kiersten. His question is, how can we make more units family friendly? A third bedroom in Sydney shouldn't be like winning the lottery. Any ideas? We need units that allow families.
I think that's a really critical question, and I was thinking as Kate was speaking as well about housing typology. We have, amongst the least diverse housing typology in Sydney of many cities. So you basically got your detached house, with a bit of garden, or you've got a 2-bedroom apartment, and there's very little being built in between. And if I look at one of the things that I think, and there's multi-pronged reasons why we're now in this housing crisis, but that lack of diversity is definitely one of them. We had more diverse housing stock in the 19th century, and some of the work we're doing around medium and low density is to try and bring back some of those housing typologies so that you can have that diversity and families can make a choice. Kate, I remember being out in Western Australia and speaking to a council there, a council of large Indigenous population, and they were saying, the communities just destroy all the houses. And when it actually got back down to it, what they were doing was modifying them for their own family needs. These houses had been built on a nuclear family outcome, and so people were building sheds in between the two houses so you could bridge and you could live as a family. Also saw that in housing outcomes in Western Sydney, where many CALD communities wanted to have grandma and grandpa, living there, but the housing stock didn't actually accommodate it. So getting more diversity into the system. I think as well, I've seen some really interesting stuff that we're hearing apocryphally, so we need to get some data on it. But in the apartment housing market, there's more 3 and 4s coming onto the market, which is terrific, and we need to make sure that we amend DCPs and stuff so that we accommodate for that as well and we make that feasible. But developers are telling me families will buy a 3 and 4 bedroom apartment now because materially people are shifting into apartment living, but then they'll buy the 1 or 2 bedroom next to it, and that's for either teenagers or their parents if they're getting a bit older. So they're kind of creating these communities themselves. People know how they want to live. We just need to build in that flexibility, not be so prescriptive about what a house looks like, not be so prescriptive about the way people want to live. So I think some of the reform piece we're doing affords that. I do think there is more listening to be done, particularly in CALD communities and particularly in First Nations communities, about what type of housing is going to work for them to be able to retain community and still make it affordable as well. So a start, but a lot to be done. I think identifying the problem is a really good start, and owning it a bit too as well.
I think I'll weave in another question. You mentioned the nuclear family. I think that's changing a lot, and it will change even more as we sort of move through the 21st century. Do you think that will also relate to a sort of maybe beginning of a new Australian dream where you don't necessarily own your home, but maybe you have a safe and secure place to rent? So I guess interested in the panel's perspective on build to rent, which also affordable housing is one of the original build to rent models. Do you see this sort of coming up more in Sydney? Maybe we'll start with Kate.
I think it's really interesting, particularly when you look at somewhere like Redfern. Redfern has been this spiritual and literal home for Indigenous peoples for decades. And with the recent Pemulwuy redevelopment, which I think followed all best practices in terms of talking to community, consulting, and the fact that there are still, I think, 62 families living on what was formerly known as the block site. But I think that's what Mob wants. Mob wants to just have somewhere that they can put down roots. They don't want to have the insecurity of trying to get a rental because we know that there is discrimination and there is racism, and that's particularly difficult. And also, on any rental application, it would be the same for a called family saying, it's me, it's my mum, it's my dad, it's my nan, and it's my 4 kids. Probably doesn't put you at the top of the list for a rental opportunity. So seeing what they've done in Redfern, whether you love it or you hate it, and it's definitely polarised Indigenous communities and border people as well, I think it does serve as a really interesting case study, because I think we will see that happening in Western Sydney soon, and I hope someone smarter than me is making note of this and watching almost like a comparative policy process so that we can take the lessons learned from Pemulwuy and apply them, because Indigenous people still need access to those not traditionally sacred sites, but sites that and places and placekeeping that is at the heart of our community.
And how you've got a lot to worry about in Year 12. Is the sort of struggle of housing also seeping in?
Yeah, definitely. I think the difficulty of being able to find a place to rent, I think lately we've seen some really disturbing examples of very small places that people are asking to rent. I think I saw a photo of, I think it was just kind of a curtained off bed and like a bedside table for quite a lot renting. So I think that is a big difficulty for a lot of young people moving out of home. And I think that period of leaving high school, going into university is already quite a difficult period, obviously, you know, knowing what I want to do, being able to navigate that. But also the added pressure of trying to be able to rent and find a home, I know is a worry for a lot of young people. And, you know, we see the really harmful impacts of that with the fact that, you know, I think, almost a quarter of young people, almost a quarter of the homeless population are young people. So I think that has really negative outcomes for young people's mental health, for their stability, and for just being able to have a safe place to live.
And you've reminded me, I remember when they were doing the Pemulwuy development, one of the most contentious issues that they were going to put a tall tower of student housing in. And I was living near that area at the time, and I remember reading it and thinking, this is student housing, and it was like $500 a week. And I'm like, what student can afford that? Like, this is clearly targeting one segment of the student population, and it is probably, you know, I'm assuming it's international students, and of course international students have a right to that. But again, this idea of student housing does not equate affordable housing, and that does not necessarily translate to the majority of students.
Yeah, definitely. And I think also just going back to what we were talking about before, accounting for diverse families. So I think that's just, you know, for me, I have quite a large extended family. I'm really fortunate in that we have secure housing. But I know for a lot of kind of extended family and friends, you have quite a big family, in-laws, grandparents and children. If you're renting a place, it can be incredibly difficult to move if that's something the landlord tells you to do. I think, yeah, just making sure that housing is much more accessible to diverse communities and diverse families is really important.
Can I pick up on something there? Because it's the security of tenancy will shift people to feeling more comfortable about renting. I lived in rental properties till I was 35, both as a kid. My family didn't own their own home, and then till I could afford my own home at 35. And I had no problems being in rented properties. What I hated was that you were moving every 18 months and you know, you were in that constant anxiety about where you were going to move, where you were going to live. You couldn't necessarily have your pets in there. I used to hide my cats in my car when I got my rental inspection. And so I think some of the stuff in the build to rent market around making sure that there is that longer term security of tenancy, that people can be in somewhere and think, okay, well, I can stay in here for a decade, either because they're just happy to rent, and we do see, you know, people who are quite content to rent. If we can crack that and make sure that tenants' rights are respected, and it doesn't become, you know, a gamble every time your landlord decides they want to sell or change, and that's fine. That's, you know, that's part of the private market, and we need people to invest in market-led so that there is rental properties. But the security of tenancy, I think, is the big piece, and it is one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited about build to rent. Build to rent has a role to play in the affordable housing market, but it certainly is not the be-all and end-all of affordable housing, and some BTR is certainly not what I would describe it as affordable housing. Terrific places to live, but not affordable housing. We just need to get that security of tenancy right.
Cool. This one's for everyone. So is building more housing enough for Sydney? What do we need to do as a city to ensure that people can and will want to stay here? And maybe I'll start with you, Anhaar.
Yeah, I think definitely building housing is an important step. You know, like I mentioned earlier, there are really concerning rates of youth homelessness. I think trying to be able to find an affordable place to stay is a huge concern. But I think it's more than just being able to have a house. I think building communities that are really interconnected is really, really important. I think after the COVID-19 pandemic, we see a lot of loneliness, particularly among young people. 75% of young people reported worse mental health after the pandemic. And I think being able to connect young people with family and friends is really important. I think that just goes back again to consultation and young people being able to have a voice. I think it's really interesting. We have this really big gap between places for kids to have, leisure spaces, but then in the kind of adolescent space, there's not that many outdoor spaces or libraries or study areas for that group, and I think that cohort definitely needs to see more infrastructure targeted to them. But I think also it's not just about housing. There are heaps of other affordability concerns young people have, whether that's, groceries and medicine, but I think also transport is a huge one. I think having more affordable transport is so important because we know if we're looking at sustainability models where that's a really important thing for young people, we know that public transport is way more sustainable than things like driving a car. So I think making public transport more affordable and even free would be really good for young people's productivity, for climate change, and for people being able to just get around Sydney easier.
Thank you. Do you want to go next, Kate?
I'd agree. I don't think it's just about the affordability either. It's about the effectiveness and how fast public transport is. Because I think for people in my generation, you're trying to generally do a career and, as I said, caring. And it's the time that it takes to travel between sites. So people are choosing, particularly women, are choosing to opt in or opt out of certain career paths because they don't want to spend an hour and a half on public transport getting to their site because then they just don't get to see their children, or you're picking them up. You're the last mum there or the last parent there at 5 to 6 and you're getting shamed out because, you're the last mum there. I think it's also about having really high quality public open space is important. And as we've said, that depends, the kind of space that you want depends on probably where you are in your life journey, whether you want parks or whether you want something for teenagers or for even older people to come together somewhere and congregate. I think people overwhelmingly, they want a sense of community, and the planning system has a lot to play in that because it's being able to walk down the street and I think see familiar faces, or having somewhere to go that isn't just a coffee shop. I think we build the communities around us, particularly in Sydney. Speaking as someone that is not from Sydney, I had to start my own little community here, and it wasn't until the pandemic and I'm roaming the streets of because we had that 5-kilometre restriction, roaming the streets, and you start seeing those familiar faces. You start building that connection. You go to school, you catch this train every day with the same people. I think that is what brings people together. I don't know how to create that, but I think the planning system has a lot to do with that in creating hubs.
I absolutely agree with you, Kate. And one of the things we talk about is how do we move away from planning as just a process to being an outcome, right? So you're not just building housing, you're actually building communities, and you're building them in from day one, or, retrofitting where you need to. Interesting, I spoke to some of the student planners at the Department of Planning the other day, and they asked me what's great about being in the planning department. And I said, well, we've got an immediate housing crisis and immediate housing targets, and we need to respond to that. And having a crisis sharpens your focus and attention. But as student planners, some of the decisions you make, your great-great-grandchildren will be walking in those communities. And that's an exceptionally powerful thing to motivate you to think about what intergenerations need. Absolutely agree with you on the public open space. When you come out of a local government background like I am, when you mess up the park, you know about it really quickly. That's a really big issue. But I think as well, there's the things that we forgot about for a while in the planning system. Where's your local corner store? What do you do if you've run out of nappies? Do you have to get in your car and go to a big shopping centre? That's not a great way to live. Have you built in your footpaths? Are there a place where you can go to your local cafe and meet people? Or is there entertainment after 6 p.m? Are there things to do? And I think part of the opportunity that we're afforded at the moment is, as we are looking at density and unashamedly looking at density, we can think really strategically about what are those value adds for community, not just to ensure we don't lose the social licence, though that is critical as well, but for all those reasons. We are building communities for the future, and we want to make sure that all those elements are coming into play, from, being able to go and see a band to, being able to take your kid to the corner store to get a ice cream after what's going to be a really hot day at school today, and I think a planning system that is more matured out builds for a community, not just for a single development.
So one last question, and I'm having struggle picking from all of your questions that you've submitted. I might go with Cara. She's asked Kiersten, and everyone, if you want one last final comment as well, jump in. How can planning embed social value, balancing housing drivers with social cohesion in things like strata, and also country-centred public spaces and thriving communities? And I'm going to add to her question, and the environment as well. So how do we balance social, environmental, economic through the planning system?
Well, the planning system at its heart is meant to take all those pillars into play, and the Planning Act is written to do that. So planners do take these elements into consideration. I think I come back to the local voice again as well. Local people, people in local communities understand what they want in their own community, but we are only hearing the voices of those who already exist in those communities. We need to be open to the voices of those who are coming beyond us in the future. And materially, and I'm loving to hear, we've got concern for climate change, desire for public transport, desire for socially cohesive communities, desire for intergenerational ability to be together, to engage, to come into the local park. The more we're hearing those voices advocating every time a planning proposal hits a council or a DA is being assessed, I think the more likely we are to make sure we balance out all of those elements, because when you're 16, you're looking for an eye to the future, right? You are going to want to make sure we have got those things right.
I think as well we have to listen to those first voices. Like Indigenous peoples, they're the first town planners, aren't they? And so many of our modern communities, even our modern roads, are built are essentially around the same plans and the same pathways. Exactly. That First Peoples have been doing for 80-odd thousand years. Listen to those voices. There's not enough Indigenous people in the planning system. There are some fantastic up-and-coming Indigenous planners. Ellie Davidson from Zion is incredible. They've been doing this for a long time in terms of finding the balance. Like, how can we live in these intergenerational families, or how can we live adaptively, working with country on country, acknowledging that in our systems. Those traditional thought processes, I think, need to inform the planning system, the local decision-making, everything, and that comes down to representation.
Any last comments?
Yeah, I think I just want to touch on the video that we watched earlier. I think that was really insightful about the importance of recognising that all lives have the same moral value, no matter where you're born, but also when you're born. So I think just factoring that into planning, that First Nations people, culturally and linguistically diverse people, young people and future generations all have the same right to a sustainable, equal, and also really socially cohesive future.
Well, on that note, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, Estelle.